Alright, here we go. Said I was going to do it, so finally I'm going to say that I'm going to do something and actually stick to it because I'm too spontaneous, and that has been to my detriment throughout my entire life. So here we go. Aristotle. This is from A.C. Grayling's book, The History of Philosophy, which he published. When did he publish it? Great question. 2019, published by Penguin in 2020, so yeah, 2019. But it was the first history of philosophy, so to speak, comprehensive history of, at least this is Western philosophy, of course. And he does cover some Eastern philosophy in here. Probably not as comprehensively as he could have if he dedicated the book to purely more so Eastern philosophy. But anyway, it was the first history of philosophy in one work, published for decades. Probably, they say, the most comprehensive since Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century. So anyway, the reason I'm wanting to just record this bit about Aristotle is because I just think people have absolutely no clue just how important this one philosopher, this one human was in influencing Western thought and the pretty much thoughts of anyone today, and what we do, how we look at the world, how we conceive of ourselves in the world, what language we use to describe, or even the language we use, what the words mean, what anything means in terms of us and our relation to the world, and why we do anything at all. So much of that depends on this one man who lived over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle's conceptualizations and ideas and things that he wrote down, and his intellectual achievements, really, and what he did for Western mind, or the minds of anyone to ever live in the West since, and in the world now, of course. So anyway, here it is. This is A.C. Grayling's writing, not me. This is just a recording of me reading this bit of A.C. Grayling's depiction of Aristotle. Here it is. Aristotle was born in 384 BCE, 15 years after the death of Socrates in Stagira in Macedonia. He died at Chalcis 62 years later. His lifetime spanned an epoch. It stretched from the last days of an independent and truly classical Athens, where he went as a teenager to study in Plato's academy, to the subsumption of all Greece in the Macedonian monarchy and the empire of Alexander the Great. Aristotle's father was the court physician to the king of Macedonia, Amyntas III, which meant that the family belonged by birthright to the medical guild of the Asclepiads, named for Asclepius, the god of medicine, obviously back in the Greek conception of gods and things in their polytheism. Aristotle's father died while he was still a minor, so he was left to the care of a guardian, Proxenus, who sent him at the age of 18 to study in Athens with Plato. He remained a member of the academy, first as a pupil, then as a colleague for 20 years until Plato's death in 347 BCE. He and a fellow student, Xenocrates, left Athens because it is thought they did not like the appointment of Plato's nephew, Speusippus. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing some of these Greek names right, but you get the gist. As the next head of the academy, Aristotle might not have been a candidate for the headship and was not elected. He might have been a candidate and was not elected, or it could be that he disagreed with Speusippus's philosophical approach, which was markedly Pythagorean. Whatever the reason, he and Xenocrates went to teach at a branch of the academy in the little Ionian city of Assos. The ruler of this city, Hermias, was a remarkable man who had started life as a slave and rose by his own great talents. He was an enlightened individual and encouraged the academicians in his city. Academicians. Wow. Aristotle had 3 contented years there, during which he married Hermias' niece Pythias, and then he moved to the nearby island of Lesbos. This was almost certainly because he wished to pursue his empirical interests in marine biology. In 343 BCE, Aristotle went to Pella, the seat of King Philip of Macedon, where he was appointed tutor, in all likelihood one of the tutors, to where he was appointed one of the tutors to the throne, then a boy of 13, Aristotle was. This was the youth, hang on a minute. No, the boy of 13 was the youth known to history as Alexander the Great. Much speculation surrounds the fact that the great philosopher and the great conqueror bore this relation to one another, though the briefest reflection shows that Aristotle could not have had very much influence on the prince. Aristotle liked the idea of small republican polities. Alexander created a vast empire, all the way to the banks of the Jumna in India. Aristotle's ethics taught moderation in all things. Alexander drank himself to death at an early age. If indeed there was any influence, it seems therefore to have been an entirely negative one, but legend was too tempted by the juxtaposition of these mighty names not to wrap itself around them. Plutarch exemplifies the point, uncritically quoting supposed letters between the philosopher and the king, letters which are almost certainly forgeries. Philip was murdered in 336 BCE and Alexander succeeded him. Aristotle left Macedonia and went back to Athens, there founding his own school. It was located in the Lyceum, a gymnasium in the northern suburbs of Athens. His school came to be called the Peripatetic School. Peripatetic? I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Could be wrong. Probably is. School because he lectured in the building's portico, the peripatos. The word peripatetic means walking up and down. It is unlikely that Aristotle read from those elaborate lectures of his on the move, with disciples scurrying behind him. The name of the school is architectural, not descriptive of classroom activity. Well, who would have thought? Just gonna have a quick drink. The school lasted for 12 years under Aristotle's direct leadership. But then his former pupil Alexander, by now ruler of a great slice of the known world, suddenly took an unwelcome interest in him. Alexander thought that Aristotle was part of a conspiracy to have him assassinated, and therefore instructed his viceroy at Athens, Antipater, to arrest him. The reason lay with a cousin of Aristotle's called Callisthenes, who was the historian at Alexander's court, appointed to keep a record of the conqueror's campaigns. Alexander had begun to adopt the style of the Oriental rulers he conquered, aping their pomp and circumstance, among other things, requiring his subjects to prostrate themselves on the floor below him. This caused resentment among his Greek followers. I wonder why. Callisthenes criticized Alexander for this, thereby angering him, though shortly afterwards he gave up the Oriental pose for good. Callisthenes was accused of trying to incite Alexander's pages to assassinate him and was hanged. Alexander thought that Aristotle lay behind the attempt. The charge brought against Aristotle was the convenient one of impiety, just as with Socrates. The alleged impiety related to a poem he had written in praise of Hermias 20 years before. It was claimed that Aristotle's intention in the poem was to deify a mortal. Discretion being the better part of valour, and Aristotle being a man of common sense, he left Athens, saying, in allusion to its treatment of Socrates, that he was saving it from committing a second crime against philosophy. He went to Chalcis on Euboea with his pupils and there died a year later. Obviously when, this is me talking by the way, obviously when he famously said, left Athens, unlike Socrates who decided to stay, and although did have a choice when sentenced to death by that charge of impiety and corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens, which he obviously drank hemlock and, took the hemlock and decided to stay and therefore died as a result of those charges. Obviously what Aristotle's saying by saying that he left, that by his leaving he was saving Athens from committing a second crime against philosophy. That's what he's referring to there, of course. Just in case people were wondering. In his physics, this is now getting into the actual Aristotelian philosophy, and this is where I think this is just the profundity of how much, when you realise how massive this contribution of Aristotle's work, this is just a summary that A.C. Grayling's writing of the overview of the totality of Aristotle's contributions to philosophy and his different, he was basically the sole, pioneer, inventor of whole modalities of education, like, science. Obviously Pythagoras was prior to Aristotle and Plato, and they did a whole lot of contributing to mathematics and physics and things. But all of these different things, like if it wasn't for, we owe so much of what we know and how we look at and how we even learn of these different topics and modes of education, that to Aristotle we owe so much of it simply to this one man. So I think it's just important to even simply appreciate, or at least become aware of, historically, how those things even came to be what they are, and therefore how most of Western thought has since been shaped as a result. So here it is. In his Physics, Aristotle describes the division of philosophy, or the sciences. They were the same thing, as he saw it. This was the general framework of the studies mentioned above in connection with Aristotle's systematic approach. The overarching division is between theoretical or speculative philosophy and practical philosophy. Theoretical philosophy has three components. The most general is first philosophy, afterwards known as metaphysics, then mathematics, then physics. Physics deals with physis, or nature, and all it contains, from the heavenly bodies to plants and animals. The phenomena studied in physics are material and have motion. This is the most specific of the theoretical sciences. Mathematics deals with measurement and quantity. It is less specific, more general than physics. Metaphysics is the most general of all. It deals with being qua being, and with the fundamental and universal characteristics of everything in reality. Practical philosophy is one thing. It is politics, of which ethics is an integral part. Politics means the study of the polis, the state. And since the state is the society of people who constitute it, ethics and politics are continuous with each other. You might say that Aristotle thought of politics as the theory of conduct in general. In later thinking, practical philosophy tends to be arranged into three branches: ethics, economics, and politics. But Aristotle saw these pursuits as too intimately related to subdivide them. Some add a third division to Aristotle's scheme, to give a place to art in the Greek sense of techne, which includes craft and skill of all kinds. It would seem that the rhetoric and the poetics fit this bill, but in fact they differ from Aristotle's other works in being practical manuals rather than critical explorations of their subject matter. And if one were in the business of expanding the catalogue of Aristotelian inquiries, one would add what he called analytics, the science of logic. Because logic is required in all the sciences, he himself saw it not as a separate department of inquiry, but as methodologically presupposed to the others, in the sense of laying down inquiry's rules and procedures. What follows is an account of Aristotle's contributions in each of these domains, beginning with logic. It should be pointed out that as the extant works of Aristotle are edited versions of lectures and research notes, there is often considerable obscurity in what he wrote. Much of it is extremely difficult, and scholarly debate rages around it. The following outline must be read in that light. So, if that was actually the overview by A.C. Grayling of what's to come, now we're getting into the gist of it. So, Aristotle's writings on logic are known as the organon, which means instrument, indicating that they are treatises on the methods of inquiry and reasoning. His brilliant systematization of the science of logic itself is laid out in the categories on interpretation and prior analytics. What might be thought of as an epistemology, in that it addresses the question of valid reasoning in science, is given the posterior analytics. Discussions of tentative and probabilistic reasoning and of fallacious reasoning constitute the topics and the sophistical refutations, respectively. Those are works by his, by the way. It is helpful to know something about Aristotle's logic because important developments in later philosophy either turned upon it or were sparked by extensions and developments of it, especially in the work of Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, and others in 20th century analytic philosophy. Aristotle took it that the fundamental unit of logical interest is the proposition, the what is said by an utterance, this what is said being either true or false. A proposition is not a sentence. The sentences snow is white, she ist weiß, la neige est blanche, hue she blade, respectively in English, German, French, and Mandarin. I hope I tried to pronounce those in the other languages somehow correctly, but anyway. So that is snow is white in respectively the different languages of English, German, French, and Mandarin, all expresses the same proposition. So do the sentences snow is white, whiteness is a property exemplified by snow, precipitated ice crystals nucleated around atmospheric particles typically scatter all the visible wavelengths of light. Likewise, I have a headache, as said by me, might be false, but as said by you might be true. Here, therefore, the same sentence expresses different propositions. The structure of propositions is analysed by Aristotle into two chief components, the subject and the predicate. The subject is that about which something, true or false, is asserted. The predicate is what is asserted about the subject. So in snow is white, the subject term is snow, and the subject is snow. And the predicate term is white, because obviously snow, it's predicated on the fact that it's white, of course. And whiteness is predicated of, he just says that, said about the subject. These terms are the focus of his attention. His logical writings contain two slightly different accounts of how they are to be classified. One is the scheme of categories, sometimes known as the predicaments, and the other is what came to be known as the 5 words or 5 predicables. The intention behind the notion of the categories is to reveal what we are saying when we make an assertion of the forms A is B, A is a B, A's are B's. For example, if I say A is white, the predicate is in the category of quality, that is, it tells us what A is like. If I say A is a snowflake, the predicate falls into the category of substance, that is, it tells us what thing it is. If I say there are 5 snowflakes, the predicate falls into the category of quantity, how many there are. If I say one snowflake fell after another snowflake, the predicate is in the category of relation, how they were related to each other. In this case, in time. John is Peter's father is another example of the category of relation, in this case in genetics. Substance, quality, quantity, and relation are the four main categories. Aristotle adds 6 others: place, time, position, condition, activity, passivity. He does not claim that this list is complete or exhaustive, and because there are prefigurings of this classification in Plato, it is likely that Aristotle took his starting point from there. From noting that we often talk about all things, or some things, or at least one thing of a certain group having a certain property, or that we deny that they have such a property, Aristotle distinguished between universal and particular propositions, and between affirmative and negative propositions. All A's are B is a universal affirmative proposition, while no A's are B is a universal negative proposition. Obviously, because saying all A's are B's is affirming, all A's are B is affirming that what they are, and saying no A's are B is negating that. So some A's are B and some A's are not B are respectively particular affirmative and particular negative propositions. Think of the terms in question as denoting classes of things, so that when we say all A's are B, or for this purpose better, all A's are B's, we can think of the things that are B as represented by a circle, and the things that are A as represented by a circle the same size or smaller. So that when we are saying, I guess he means like a Venn diagram, so that when we say all A's are B's, we are saying that the circle of A's lies wholly on or within the circle of B's. Yeah, actually, you've got a little asterisk there, and down the bottom it says, these relationships are well represented by Venn diagrams. There you go. Likewise, we say some A's are B's. When we say some A's are B's, we mean that the circle representing A's partly overlaps with the circle representing B's, and so on. Aristotle's investigation of how such classes relate to each other as representable in these ways gave him the concept of a classification into genus, species, difference, property, and accident. These are the 5 words. Quinquevoses, the Greek terminology for it, as later logicians called them, and they list the ways in which a predicate can relate to a subject, or alternatively put, the ways in which we can speak about something. You can speak about something specifically or generally. That is species and genus. See, species derives from specific, genus derives from generally. It's what is general about something, whereas species is what is specific about something. You can talk about the differences between species of things that separate them from each other. That is difference. You can talk about the characteristics of something that are found in all instances of the class of things it belongs to. These are properties. Or you can speak of a characteristic that something happens to have, but which it could just as likely not have, which it has accidentally, so to speak. These are accidents, like the shape of a shoe or the colour of a shirt. The species, or as Aristotle first called it, the definition of a thing, relates to its essence. What makes it what it is factor. It is specific to the thing in question. The genus is that part of the thing's essence which is not unique to it, but is shared with other things of the same kind in general. So, lion is a species of the genus animal. Biological taxonomy differs from this classification, having a more detailed hierarchy in descending order: domains, kingdoms, phyla, classes, orders, families, genera, and species. That was in brackets. The differentia distinguish one species from another within a genus. They are what makes circles different from squares, though they are both instances of shape. These concepts gave Aristotle his fundamental view about how we categorize or define anything. We do it by genus and difference. What Aristotle wished to achieve was understanding. That is, he wished to give explanations of things and ultimately of the universe itself. The Greek word for explanation, aisha, also means cause, and Aristotle framed the task of explaining things as ascertaining their causes. To know or understand something, he said, is to know its cause. Now have a think about that for a minute and tell me you're not. Think about anything that you think you understand, and then, so Aristotle said, to know or understand something is to know its cause. Think about it. I spun out for a minute there earlier. Anyway, I pondered on that for a long time and it was fun. Now, causes themselves have causes, and there is a risk that the chain of explanation by causes might run back forever. This is where definition enters the picture. Suppose you explain A by saying it was caused by B, and that B was caused by C. You will reach a point, say D, or perhaps eventually Z, where the explanation stops because at that point we say, because it is what it is. We have reached the definition of the thing, an account of its nature from which explanations of C and B and A follow. Aristotle identified 4 causes: material, efficient, formal, and final. Suppose you wish to explain what a table is. You cite the material cause, the wood from which it is made, the efficient cause, the carpenter's work that brought it into being, the formal cause, the form of the thing, the pattern or design that the carpenter followed in making the table, and the final cause, the end, aim, or purpose for which the table was made. When you have given all 4 causes, you have given an explanation. Of these, the most important is the final cause, the purpose or aim, the telos. Explanations given in terms of final causes are called teleological explanations. Aristotle's epistemology and metaphysics are sharply different from Plato's. Plato's theory requires transcendent forms as the only appropriate objects of knowledge, properly so called, and therefore they must exist in a realm accessible only to the mind. Aristotle described Plato's theory as merely a poetic metaphor. Its worst fault, in his view, is its inability to explain change and how new substances come into being. How can transcendent, eternal, unchanging forms cause anything in the realm of becoming, where everything is in constant motion, change, and flux? Aristotle's view is that instead of thinking of individual things as copies of, or somehow participants in, a form, we should see them as composites of both matter and form, the form being immanent in the matter. When we say snow is white, we are not attributing the presence of a really existing abstract, universal whiteness to the snow. We are experiencing a concrete thing. Con signifies with or together. Concrete denotes the accretion or joining together of 2 or more things, constituting white snow. Aristotle's account of change turns on the idea of potentiality, in Greek dunamis, from which we get the word dynamic. Substances have a potentiality either to be changed by something acting on them, which is passive potential, or to cause change in other substances, which is what animate things can do because they possess active potential, such as us, humans. Change requires the realization of potentiality, the making of the potential actual, which he calls energia. This leads to Aristotle's thesis about the first cause of all things. Given that everything is a concretion of matter and form which have been united by a cause, and given that the causal chain cannot regress to earlier and earlier causes forever, there must be a first cause, which to break the regress must be self-caused. This self-causing first mover of the universe must, said Aristotle, be a mind, the nature of which is pure thought. That blew, so to speak, my mind when I read that earlier, because I was like, whoa, of all the thinking I've done, that's pretty much what like if I was to conceive of the beginning of all that is, and it's not that different to what Aristotle came to think. Not that I have an opinion or think I have any idea of anything whatsoever, but that from the thinking that I've done, that's about as good as I can conceive of how things might have begun to. Like, it's sort of like similar to the Kabbalion, how it's like all is mind, the universe is mental, similar to that concept of how things are. Anyway, so this self-causing first mover of the universe must, said Aristotle, be a mind, the nature of which is pure thought. It thinks about the highest thing that there is, which is thought, hence it is pure thought thinking about itself. It thinks about the highest thing there is, which is thought, hence it is pure thought thinking about itself. To this he gives the name God. Whoa, big label there, isn't it? What a different connotation people would derive from that, hearing the word God now, to what they might have conceived of it or thought its meaning was 2,000 years ago. Hey, it's crazy how the meaning of words of the same language can change so dramatically over time. His reason for thinking that the first cause must be a mind or soul is that the explanation for how animate beings can move themselves is that they have souls. Yes, the account is circular. All animate things have nutritive souls, which motivate them in their most basic functions of eating and reproducing. Of course, remember, this is just Aristotle's philosophy of what he conceived. No one's trying to say that this is the definite how things are. This is just what Aristotle came to over 2,000 years ago, thinking as a philosopher in ancient Greece. So here we go. Back to this. All animals and some plants also have a sensitive aspect to their souls, which enables them to perceive the environment and respond to it. Human beings have both these and a third aspect to the soul, said Aristotle, rationality, which enables them to think. For a living thing, the soul is the efficient, formal, and final cause of its being. Only the material cause relates to its body. Aristotle took the view that sensation is a passive quality of souls, allowing them to be changed by their body's contact with things in their external environment. We use the word informed now as an echo of this theory. When one of our sense organs is acted upon by an external object, the soul becomes potentially what the external object is actually by taking on the form, not of course the matter, of the object. Suppose I pick up a ball. The feeling of a round object consists in having the form of that object carried to my soul from my hands. Obviously, Aristotle's concept of soul, just getting back to this real quick, is its, I guess, perception or experience, or what it thinks, its mind, which is how we are able to experience anything, because that's consciousness, I guess you could call it too, the soul. Suppose I pick up a ball. The feeling of a round object consists in having the form of that object carried to my soul. You could conceive of it as consciousness, perception, experience, from my hands. I am thus informed of, more accurately by, the shape of the ball. Thought is the soul focusing upon forms without necessarily or even often being prompted to do so by the action of an external thing. Of course, there could not be such thought without preceding contact with things, Aristotle says. thereby giving rise to the principle, nothing in mind that was not first in the senses, a principle of empiricism. But both thought and imagination consist in the soul presenting to itself forms and the relationships between forms independently of an actual stimulus to do so from outside. Activity and motion are the result of desire, Aristotle said. All animate things, to a greater or lesser degree, are aware of their internal states in what in the external world might address those states, satisfy or remedy them, whether they are of hunger, pain, a wish for pleasure, and more. The foregoing account summarizes the salient points in Aristotle's metaphysics and psychology. In regard to metaphysics, Aristotle attached great significance to the question of being qua being, of what is, purely in its character of being, and the properties which it has as such. Metaphysics is accordingly the attempt to grasp the fundamental nature of existence. In this inquiry, the category of primary importance is substance, ousia. As we see in the logic of the categories, substance predicates are those invoked in answer to questions of the form, what is X? The answer to the question, what is Socrates, is appropriately, he is a man, where man is the substance predicate. But this is not yet to get to the bottom of things. For Aristotle, the more fundamental point, both literally and logically, is that substances are ultimate subjects. They are separable. By ultimate subject, he means that they exist in their own right. By separable, he means that they can be separated from the accidents that characterize them. For example, a man is an individual substance. Suppose he has a limp. His limp cannot be separated from him and exist on its own, so limpingness is not a separable substance, but the man is. He can be conceived of apart from his limp. This account of a difficult doctrine in Aristotle doubtless amplifies rather than clarifies the problems in it. If anything helps to clarify it somewhat, it is the etymology of the word substance itself, substance, or, as one might say, standing under or underneath. Somewhat captures the idea of what exists or has being in its own right, as a fundamental category of a thing, upon which other things supervene or are dependent. Colours cannot exist without being colours of something, nor can there be limps unless there is something doing the limping. They are dependent things. Okay, so that's his metaphysics. Aristotle's views in practical philosophy, ethics and politics are much plainer sailing than his metaphysics and psychology. They turn on the idea that the best kind of society is one whose individual members live the best kind of lives. Later philosophy has found the ethical aspect of his views more enduringly important than the political aspect because they are philosophically far richer. But to see how the different aspects of Aristotle's practical philosophy hang together, we can note the following. A person who makes swords has the production of swords as the end, telos, or goal of his activity. But to the soldier, the sword is merely an instrument to his own different end, which is to kill or incapacitate his enemy. But this, in turn, is only part of the yet higher goal of the ruler, whose aim is to defend the state. The ruler directs the soldier whom and where to fight, and the soldier tells the sword maker what length and sharpness he requires in a sword. The highest art lies with the ruler, for he has direction of the state. What the others do, each in achieving his own more particular end, serves this highest end. Therefore, says Aristotle, politics is the highest art. All other arts and crafts are subservient to it, for politics aims at the overall well-being of a society. Now, what I thought as a person who loves philosophy and would identify, if by nothing else, as a philosopher, would be, and I'm sure some of you probably would be thinking the same thing, wait a minute, if politics is the highest aim, then who educates to politicians on what political ideologies to propound in their political career, or, what they advocate for in their politics. Well, how do political ideologies become formed? Well, it is philosophers philosophizing about political ideology itself, and therefore, so all culture actually stems from philosophizing about how a culture might be, and how a culture what morals or ethics or things the culture values, and therefore what it's based upon. So it actually stems from philosophy. Anywho, he'll get to that here. Among the various subordinate arts that help in the achievement of this highest end is education, because this is what forms character, the combination of intellectual and moral qualities that make the best kind of person. What is the best kind of character? That is the question to be answered by ethics. Pardon me. There are two ethical treatises bearing Aristotle's name, the Eudemian Ethics and Nicomachean Ethics. These are names given by later commentators. Aristotle himself refers in the Politics to what he had earlier said in a work he describes as Ta Ethica, or on character. The names of the treatises allude to his friend Eudemus and his son Nicomachus, who were said to have edited them. The Nicomachean Ethics is a fuller and doubtless later work than the Eudemian Ethics, and quite likely postdates the Politics itself. A text called Magna Moralia has also been attributed to Aristotle, but it is more likely the work of a student or follower. That was just a little asterisk note. Aristotle's writings on ethics are the first ever treatises devoted wholly and systematically to the subject, and they are among the greatest. How crazy, honestly, how crazy, I'm just thinking again, reflecting on that Aristotle, one of the first ever people to even conceive of politics, or, how a political system might be, or how a society, or the ideal way of people to cooperate in a functioning, healthy way in a society or political state, whatever. How crazy that the fact that he was one of the first to ever even think of those things, and his thinking on those things is still looked upon as like probably some of the best, if not the best, ways of conceiving those very things. It's pretty crazy. Aristotle's technique was to look at commonly held views about things, the endoxa, and the disagreements that arise about them, and to find a resolution to the disagreements. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he begins by noting that every pursuit aims at some good, which means that there are as many different kinds of good as there are pursuits. Such things as boat building, military strategy, and getting rich each requires subordinate goods to be attained. In carpentry, sword making, starting a business, each of which has its own set of subordinate ends to be achieved first, and so on. Each good is an end serving a higher end. But what is the supreme end, the highest good? It will be the end desired for its own sake, not as a means to anything beyond itself. And what is that end which is desirable for its own sake? There is very general agreement about this, says Aristotle. Both the general run of men and people of superior refinement say that it is happiness, or eudaimonia. Happiness is an inadequate translation of this term. This term he's talking about, eudaimonia, which is obviously translated from the Greek, which was eudaimonia, to now in English happiness. Anyway, so happiness is an inadequate translation. Well-being and well-doing, flourishing, those kinds of things would be better descriptions. But then they disagree about what happiness is. Some say it consists in the possession of wealth, others say of honour, others again of pleasure. And their opinions differ according to the condition they happen to be in. The poor man says wealth is happiness, the sick man says it is health. But a little thought shows that wealth, honour, pleasure, health or any other such, are not ends in themselves, they are themselves instrumental to whatever is truly the highest good. Not only is the highest good not instrumental, but because it is desired wholly for its own sake, and is sufficient of itself, but it is the thing towards which all other instrumental goods strive, the single final end of all activity. It is indeed happiness, but not as identified with any of the individual instrumental ends. Instead, it will be what we attain when we live in accordance with the function of human beings. What is the function of human beings? Aristotle approaches an answer to this question by analogies. What makes a good flute player? Skill at playing the flute. A good carpenter, one good at making things from wood. Each is good because he performs his particular function, his work, ergon, well. To do his work well is the virtue of excellence, arete, of a flute player qua flute player, or carpenter qua carpenter. What is the arete of, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that word right, arete, of a human being qua human being? It is to do the work of being human well. And what is the work of a human being? It is to live up to that thing which is distinctive and defining of humanity, namely the possession of reason. A good person is therefore a person who lives and acts rationally in accordance with virtue. The human good, says Aristotle, is activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there is more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete. So now we must understand the nature of virtue. There are two kinds of virtue, says Aristotle, those of mind and those of character. The virtues of mind further subdivide into practical wisdom and theoretical wisdom. Virtues of character include courage, temperance, and justice. Everyone is born with the capacity to develop the virtues, says Aristotle, but they have to do so by acquiring good habits in childhood and eventually, as we attain maturity, practical wisdom, phronesis. By good habits, Aristotle means a settled disposition to feel and act appropriately. An important point for him, because he disagrees with Socrates and Plato, that virtue is knowledge, a doctrine that makes no sense of the phenomenon of weakness of will, akrasia. This latter exists, he says, and is caused by ungoverned emotions. Therefore, acquiring the habit of strength of will is important. On the basis of these thoughts, he offers a definition of virtue itself. A virtue is the middle path between opposing vices, one of deficiency and the other of excess. Thus, courage is the middle path or mean between cowardice, deficiency, and rashness, excess. Generosity is the mean between meanness, deficiency, and profligacy, excess. The flute player and the carpenter know how to steer a middle course between the excesses and deficiencies that spoil their work. So too, a human being can acquire something analogous to a technical skill in knowing how to navigate between the vicious extremes, between which the mean is the associated virtue. Is there a general invariant rule about the mean in all cases? No, the individual nature of a situation matters in determining what the mean is in that case. For example, one might think that the virtue of gentleness implies that one should never be angry, for remaining calm when faced with, say, an injustice is what lies between indifference and fury in reaction to it. But Aristotle says that the nature of the case might justify being angry. To be angry in the right way, to the right degree, for the right reason is virtuous, he says, but not to such a degree that it undermines reason. Virtue makes the goal right. Practical wisdom teaches how to reach it, Aristotle says, and habits formed in developing character will help to identify the right goals. If we do not have, or do not yet have, the practical wisdom to work out how to reach those goals, we must imitate those who do have such wisdom. And Aristotle concedes that moral luck plays its part also. those in fortunate circumstances do find it easier to attain eudaimonia than those for whom life is a struggle. It would be a mistake to regard the doctrine of the mean as implying that every goal should be a compromise. The doctrine is about how we act, not about always seeking halfway house results. The critics who say that Aristotle's ethics of the middle way is by its nature middle class, middle-aged, and middle brow are confusing intended action with intended outcome. Of course, the idea of reflecting on the best course of action in a given situation, taking that situation's details into account, is intended to bring about the best outcome. But the best outcome is not therefore necessarily the outcome intermediate between what would happen if the actions implicit in either of the flanking extremes were taken. Suppose one decides to be a generous person in need of money. The opposing vices are giving him nothing and giving him far more than he asks for, or even everything you have. The generous amount is what you can afford, not half what you have. In some cases, his needs and what you can afford might prompt you to give him more than half of what you have. It will depend entirely on the case. Aristotle defined human beings as political animals, that is, beings alone capable of living together as citizens in a state. It would seem from this that his definition of the best life for people should therefore be that is the life of cooperation, of achieving harmony in the interests of a state, and that indeed is an end in Aristotle identifies as a great desideratum, especially if the state is a police which is what the Greek term was for state back then, of the kind he most approved. A small state, the ideal size being one where the voice of the town crier, the stentor, can be heard from one end to the other. Far out, we definitely do not have that these days in this age of empires and things. And this illustrates reasons why he disliked monarchy and empire, the very opposites of the kind of state he thought desirable. But in fact, there is a higher, best life for man than life as a citizen, but which being a citizen enables. Being a citizen is by its nature is a life of activity. Activity as a citizen of the police, which is the state. But the higher life is a life of contemplation, said Aristotle, or in short, the life of a philosopher. For this, after all, is the life lived in greatest conformity with the distinguishing feature of a human being, the possession and exercise of reason. In line with this view, Aristotle argues that the well-run state will be so if it provides an opportunity for leisure, for the opportunity to learn, discuss, and contemplate, not depending for our happiness on externals of status and material goods, but on being our own masters and enjoying the purest of pleasures, the exercise of our intellects. For, just as me butting in, is that not what distinguishes a human being, at least so of what we can conceive of being a human being, from any other animal that might, like rationality, we have the ability for reflection, contemplation, and therefore to plan and, think about what we might do in the future based on that and things. We can almost separate ourselves and retract ourselves from time and from the present moment and being simply bound to reactionary, instinctual behavior. And so therefore we can actually contemplate, therefore be rational and think about how we might be and, things like that, which is what Aristotle defined as the distinguishing feature of what makes human beings different. And that is our highest quality, therefore, because we are able to rationalize. In line with this view, Aristotle argues that the well-run state will be so if it provides an opportunity for leisure, for the opportunity to learn, discuss, and contemplate, not depending for our happiness on externals of status and material goods, but on being our own masters and enjoying the purest of pleasures, the exercise of our intellect. This ultimately is why we educate ourselves, he says, so that we can make a noble use of our leisure. A view very different from today's belief that education is almost wholly about getting a job. It might seem that Aristotle's subordination of ethics to politics has been reversed here, but this is not so, for in his Politics, Aristotle argues that the state came into existence in the first place so that men might live, but then as the state matures, its point develops into ensuring that men might live well. It's a pretty big distinction there, isn't it? Only in the settled and secure circumstances of a state can people have the leisure and opportunity to develop their intellectual interests, which provides them with what makes life supremely worthwhile. And that's even how people are even able to, if people didn't have the freedom to be able to think and to have leisure time to think about things in life itself, and therefore philosophize, ponder, exercise what Aristotle conceived of as the highest good for a human being, being rational. If people didn't have the freedom to be able to do that, then we would simply be bound to, living in whatever the ways of the society or the state or the functioning, the way that people are and act, which is basically to be enslaved to the system or the culture of whatever way of being and whatever time we're so happen to be living in. So that I agree with Aristotle on that. That using the ability to be rational and to therefore have to think about things and how we might act, how we should act, what is the best way, all of these things, to philosophize and be rational probably is the highest good for a human being, or the highest, it's what makes the highest good, which is eudaimonia, the highest, what we should all strive for, which is, well-being, well-doing, happiness, possible, because were it not for our ability to rationalize and to think about these things and therefore philosophize, use our minds, we would not be able to even consider or conceptualize what the highest good might even be, let alone take action to be able to possibly attain it. So I agree. Now this is the final part of his philosophy, that, these are the main additions, achievements that he was able to produce in his philosophy. Anyway, this is the last one, it's his cosmology. It is necessary to end this account of Aristotle's views with a sketch of his cosmology. This is because his cosmology provided the dominant view of the universe for nearly 2,000 years afterwards, and much of modern science and philosophy resulted from a rejection of his picture of the cosmos. This makes his book On the Heavens, Peri Orano, for most of history known as DKLO, one of the most influential in human history. Aristotle's universe is a sphere. The fixed stars are its outer circumference, and the Earth lies motionless at its center. Within the circle of the fixed stars are layers of spheres, each carrying one of the planets, and the spheres of the sun and the moon. Whereas on Earth, everything is formed out of the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, the spheres are formed of a wholly different fifth element, the ether, an invisible substance purer than fire. The apparently irregular motion of the planets, from planetae, wanderers in Greek, results from the fact that each sphere rotates on its own axis, but is influenced by the rotation of the sphere above it. So the spheres of the planets do not move synchronously with the sphere of the fixed stars, but their rotations are affected by the outermost sphere's rotation. Ingenious mathematical descriptions of these irregularities were achieved first by Hipparchus about 150 BCE, then most notably by the 2nd century CE Alexandrian astronomer Ptolemy, whose system remained the dominant one until Copernicus in the 16th century CE. The sublunary sphere, the one below the sphere of the moon, which is the lowest of the heavenly spheres, is the region of earth, air, fire, and water. The inferior elements, does not, according to Aristotle, of course, this is according to his cosmologic philosophy, inferior does not automatically mean bad or second rate, as we now think of that word when we think about its meaning, but simply below. However, it comes to have the connotation we now attach to inferior because it lacks the purity and other distinguishing properties of the ether, the superior or above element constituting the spheres, known also as the quintessence, because it is the fifth essence additional to the inferior four. Whereas the natural motion of the ether is circular. The most perfect path for anything heavenly is a circular one. The inferior elements move the inferior elements move either upwards or downwards. Earth and water move downwards, fire and earth upwards. Earth is the heaviest, fire the lightest. Things composed of inferior elements move in straight lines, unlike the superior heavenly things with their circular motion. Heavenly, of course, just meant the heavenly bodies back in the Greek term, their conception of things was just simply things in space. The doctrine of the four inferior elements came from empedocles, along with their properties of being cool, moist, hot, and dry. Things made out of them are corruptible and perishable. The heavenly bodies made of quintessence are incorruptible, imperishable, and eternal, again satisfying the Parmenidean requirements. Much of Aristotle's cosmology is suggested by Eudoxus, another of Plato's pupils, but the form in which it came to be adopted by the Christian Church was Aristotle's, and this is the reason for its longevity. As late as the 17th century CE, the Roman Catholic Church was still putting people to death if they refused to picture the universe to themselves in Aristotle's way, as happened to Giordano Bruno in 1600 CE, Giulio Cesar Vanini in 1619, and nearly to Galileo in 1632, once they figured out that the Earth wasn't the centre of the universe. The temptation to regard theories such as this as merely quaint should be tempered by the fact that until the 17th century, anyone looking up at the night sky would have seen the heavens rotating about the Earth and had no reason to think it was he or she who was rotating relative to them. That shift of perspective took a great intellectual revolution to make it possible, and at one point in the history of our species, this shift must have been a vertiginous and even terrible surprise. I've spent a lot of time myself actually contemplating just how crazy, what a monumental shift in our conception of ourselves and how we relate to the universe and everything that is. That must have been for humanity when people had to finally realize that the Earth is spinning and moving relative to everything else, and we're not actually at the center of the universe as we had genuinely believed for such a long time. So that would have been a massive shock, and there's no wonder the church was taking such harsh action to prevent that knowledge potentially getting out, which of course it ended up getting out because you can't suppress something like that for long. In the centuries immediately after Aristotle's own time, his logical works were studied and in interesting respects developed by thinkers collectively known as the Megarian school, though they were not strictly a school. The name comes from Megara, birthplace of a follower of Socrates called Euclides, whose later followers devoted themselves to logic. In other respects, however, Aristotle's influence was, to begin with, to all intents and purposes, null. Yet, although his thought was almost completely lost for a time, the tenuousness of the survival of his works, as described above, makes one shudder. Their rediscovery and survival have had an immense influence, directly and by opposition, on the later history of philosophy and science. In fact, he was twice rediscovered, once by Andronicus over 2 centuries after his death, and again in the 12th century CE, when works that had survived in lands conquered by Muslims became once more accessible in Europe. In the high medieval period, as a result of this secondary discovery, he was known simply and with justification as the philosopher, a label bestowed by Thomas Aquinas. So that's A.C. Grayling's overview of Aristotle, and the only reason I wanted to record that was, again, just to remind people or even help people become aware of just how much everything we do, think, say, conceive of in the world, how we relate to it, what we look when we look at something, do something, how we think about things, depends on the thought and the philosophy of Aristotle. So, thank you.